Welcome, everybody. My name is Jessica McDonald. I'm the Nancy Inman and Marlene Nathan Meyerson Curator of Photography at the Ransom Center in Austin, Texas. And today we're going to be talking with Bea Nettles. Bea Nettles is an artist and educator who's been making groundbreaking works in a variety of media that collapse the distinction between private and professional life for 50 years. Born in Gainesville, Florida, she taught at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign starting in 1984 when she established the undergraduate program in photography there, was chair until 1999, and retired as professor emerita in 2008. There are many, many more biographical details I could share with you, including an endless number of awards and grants and accomplishments, but lucky for us, there has just been the publication of a wonderful monograph behind me. It's the catalog for the exhibition Bea Nettles, Harvest of Memory, organized by the George Eastman Museum and the Sheldon Art Galleries in St. Louis. The show has been presented at both of those places and the Krannert Art Museum at the University of Illinois. And because of COVID, is going to be returning to the George Eastman Museum for a second viewing. And by the time you see this, it may have already been presented there. Welcome, Bea.
Thanks.
It's nice to talk with you. This series in general that we're doing, this interview series, is highlighting new acquisitions at the Ransom Center. And these acquisitions are acquisitions that have been targeted in order to fill gaps in our collection. And one of our main gaps was American sort of experimental works in the 60s and 70s. And within that, especially, we had gaps in that sort of genre of work made by women. And so today we're going to be discussing 12 works and a number of books that we've recently acquired from you in particular, but I would like to put those works in the context of your larger career. So I do want to start with some earlier works. So everything we're going to be looking at today isn't necessarily part of our collection. A great number of them are, but I want to start all the way back in Florida. So again, born in Gainesville, grew up in the lakes and the swamps and the forests of Gainesville, Florida. And you attended the University of Florida at Gainesville, starting in 1964, getting an undergraduate degree there as an art major, and photography was a required course. And you took it in your senior year. Mm-hmm. And I should maybe ask you in a moment, not now, why you waited so long for that, or if there was really no intention there. But your first trimester in your senior year, you took your required course, and it was with Robert Victor. I just want to look at very briefly, just on the screen here, let people see a photograph that you made in his fall course. In this photograph, Bea and Heart's Shape. Shape is part of the title, yes? From 1967, this is something that you made in Robert Victor's class. And we're seeing some early kind of signature things that go through your work. We're seeing a self-portrait. We're seeing some of the sort of outdoor and the duplication. We can talk more about that in a moment. But I also want to sort of, just to complete this, mention that Robert Victor encouraged you to contact Jerry Yulesman, who was also teaching there, but was on sabbatical and would be back. And so you continued your photography courses through the year and ended up working as his assistant for those next 2 trimesters of your senior year, and working in the labs in the evenings. And we've also got a couple of things to show from his classes there. So Bea, maybe you can tell us what you were doing in this one, Winky Pin Lake, and also Morning in My Backyard, which is a sort of contact sheet from medium format negatives.
Okay, if we could even start back with the Bea and Heart Shape, which was a good choice, because that was my first assignment in basic photo. And Robert gave us the assignment to take one object and do lots of things with it. So I picked the Winky Pin, which is a southern name for a dried lotus pod. And that was my object. And you see that there, it looks like a shower head. But already in that image, there's a picture of me in a bathing suit, which is as close as I got to nudity in those days, but almost as a Venus character who appears again and again in my work. Also a lake, a person coming out of the lake. So that was pretty far out for a first assignment. I did all black and white in Fictor's class, but I learned a lot of the techniques which were prevalent at the University of Florida, such as double printing, negative printing, symmetrical printing, contact printing, and so forth, already that first trimester. And then I started with Uhlsman. I was able to get a lab job so that I could pay for the equipment and for the chemistry and that sort of thing, for the film paper. And I hadn't put photography off. It just wouldn't fit my schedule. It was a very tight schedule as a painting major. So I was always wanting to take photography. So here I was continuing at this point with Jerry Uhlsman for 2 more trimesters. I actually shared his office. It was such a small program that he gave me a desk in his office. And here I also started to tone pictures. A ceramics person actually was using toner, trying to put emulsions on ceramics, and she was toning it. And I found out about toner. I thought, wow, this is really cool. It's very painterly. So the Winky Pin Lake were probably negatives that I made the first semester. And you're going to see this all the time. I really recycle images. I use them over and over. Not that I'm lazy, I'm just economical. A lot of things. Film was expensive in those days. So I already had a negative of the lake. I had the Winky Pin Lake. I wanted to try some experimental printing. So I did a whole series of these things with the circle within the rectangle. And then the one morning in my backyard is a contact sheet, literally, of my backyard in Gainesville. A senior year, I was living at home with my parents to save money. And I climbed up on the roof. You can see the ladder between my legs there, and photographed down and made the contact sheet. I shot 2 1/4 for years. So that's what you're seeing. And I hand colored it.
There seems to be some luck in coming in as an undergrad to have 2 professors who did not limit themselves and their work to ideas of straight photography. They were not opposed to combining techniques and also negatives in the darkroom. They were not opposed to sort of breaking the rules of black and white photography that were sort of prevalent. It was sort of the making pictures rather than taking pictures approach. And if you had been in another undergraduate program with really strict guidelines and a really sort of dogmatic approach in your training, you might have been, I think your ideas still may have been there, but they wouldn't have been encouraged perhaps in the way that they were, certainly by Robert Fictor. I think to go back and just make something clear, you were an art major, and even before you had taken photography courses that senior year, you had already committed to going to graduate school in painting, and you had already accepted a position. You had been offered admission into a painting program, essentially, with funding, and you planned to go. And Fictor encouraged you to take the ideas that were emerging in your painting and your other media, and he said, you know, you can put those ideas into photography too, and not just the ideas, but the methods too. So combining physical materials, inserting fragments of photographs into the kind of collages that you had been doing with drawing and painting and printmaking. And I'm just wondering, what other kinds of encouragement did he give you as you went off to graduate school? And also, I'm really interested in what you sort of faced when you hit Illinois, because I think, so you were doing hand coloring, but in a lot of graduate programs, hand coloring was scandalous and a way to cover up poor printing, or a way to sort of get out of learning how to be a photographer in some ways, or it was diluting the independence of photography. And there were a lot of people who really disagreed with those techniques, where you were so free to do that in Gainesville, and then you went to a program that had faculty who, for the most part, the most well-known and most prominent faculty person was Art Sinsabaugh, who we know for those elongated, beautiful Midwest landscapes, but they're very gelatin silver, perfectly printed, really maintaining the kind of integrity of that gel silver print. And so I would imagine you knew a little bit about that and may have even been warned that you might have to just be careful not to assume that the freedom you had in Gainesville is going to be exactly the same thing you'll experience when you arrive there. Is that fair?
That's a fair assessment. I was given a little bit of warning that this probably wouldn't go over real big, but I enrolled in photo when I got there because I needed access to a darkroom. And that was the only way you could get access to a darkroom, was to be in a photo class. So this was an advanced photo class that combined a few undergrads who'd been taking photography classes. There wasn't an established program, but there were electives. And then there was no grad program at that point, if I remember. But there were other grad students, and several from University of Florida at that level. So it was a high level photo class that I got into. And I'll go to the first class. It's held at one of the professors' homes. And we sort of showing our work. And it really felt like the ones that had gone to Florida should sit on one side of the room, because we were so different in what we thought was acceptable. And to get back to Sensibaw's work, it actually was contact printed, view camera. I mean, it was really straight photography. So I did work for the first couple of crits, and he really hated hand coloring, and he was sure I didn't know how to print, that I was hiding that. So he told me, I want you to print me 10 really good black and white prints to prove you can do it. And I started doing it. And then I thought, this just makes me almost sick to my stomach to have to do this and prove myself. So I probably did a few, but I just kept doing what I was doing. And I did so much of it that it was just undeniable that I was, into it and very serious about it. I wasn't hiding anything or being lazy. But that was the only semester I studied with him. I figured out other ways to keep working.
Well, certainly the works you made in graduate school couldn't have been made by a lazy person. And I think a really good demonstration of that, and we're going to not go exactly in chronological order, because I want to look at a couple of works that we've acquired that definitely are complicated, combine a number of processes, and show a real resourcefulness, especially in light of perhaps not having a lot of access to lab equipment and facilities, depending on the professor with whom you were enrolled at the moment. There were certain facilities limited to certain classes, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like to look at two photographs that you made in 1969. These are about 9.5 inches tall and 28 inches wide on a roll of paper. And I think people will be interested in technically how you did this. So I'm interested in sort of the symbols there, but let's talk about that after you've given an explanation of how you were able to accomplish 28-inch long photograph.
Yeah, okay. A lot of my aesthetic for many years, even a few years after grad school, was affected by economics, okay? And I think that's important for people to realize. Sometimes you just couldn't print large or color or whatever. You had to use what you had. And I found this roll of photo paper that was an A weight. It was meant to go through typewriters for thesis reports, on sale. I'm sure I got it on sale. And it was quite a long roll of paper. And that is really what determined the format of these prints. It wasn't like, oh, it's a panorama. It just made sense. It was long paper, it came in a roll. Why not use the fact that it was long and narrow? So I would cut a section of the paper and it would be rolled to one side. And then I used a combination. In Time and Travel, there's at least four, well, I see three, but three different negatives of me modeling that would have had to be put in the enlarger individually and exposed to this piece of paper. And then it was moved a little, and then another moved a little, a third one moved a little. And then I actually, it looks like I flipped the negative or something like that and did another. And then the trees that you see come in as contact prints from orthofilm negatives. So they were not enlarged, they were contact printed. So all this stuff was done. It's still a white piece of paper. I don't know what I've done, but I hope I did all right. And then I took it and dunked it into probably either a large tray or a trash can full of Dectol and swirled it around and developed it. And I made about 5 or 6 of these. And most of them turned out all right. And I was happy with them. And then I hand colored them. I did one that was really incredibly long, and it was put in a little box, and you would turn the knobs and it would go by. It reminded me of something we did in 3rd grade, which was some kind of Thanksgiving panorama box that all the kids drew on a long piece of paper. But for technical reasons, I disposed of that years ago. It was a pain to try to move from house to house. But anyway, that's how that one. And the other one that you got, the Dream series, were created, was with multiple exposures.
Well, and I want to look at that one carefully as well. I also want to just talk about these negatives that are self-portraits in Time and Travel. Is this you as Bea Nettles, or is this you as?
I'm not quite sure. I think I'm some sort of blend of a Victorian vamp in my 20s hat. I mean, I still go to thrift shops. So this was amazing clothing that I'd gotten, vintage clothing. And I'm modeling sort of in the vein of a 20s movie glamour shot, not so much mythological in this particular one. It was more about glamour and the way women are pictured and so forth. And maybe that's where the travel part came from, time travel in a sense.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking of that as the sort of time reference, and your tree here that appears in a number of places. We can look at this work you made a little bit earlier, just a few months earlier, called My Favorite Tree, Coming and Going in 1969. That's a work that we don't own, but it shows the kind of repetition. You're building up a repertoire of images. You're building up this personal stock of meaningful symbolic images that will appear again and again. And so we see that also in the Dream series. Here we have the tree again.
Yeah.
We also have a statue of Venus that was in a garden in Illinois, I believe, that we see repeated elsewhere. We've got a very prevalent star symbol right in the center there, which we'll see a lot of. And there's another self-portrait. And here you've told me you were posed as Medusa. Yeah,
this is something I do a lot, this stretch. I don't know why, maybe just because it feels good, but it's an intense, and you'll see it in other images. It's an intense stare, and it is the Medusa figure. By that point, I had probably picked up on reading more mythology. And that was actually at the urging of my mother, who by this point in time had gone back to grad school in her 50s, gotten a master's in English, had begun, she began a year after this to write poetry, which was just amazing. But she would look at my work. She was one of my biggest supporters. And she'd say, "Oh, honey, you're working with archetypes. That's the tree of life." And I'd say, "Oh, Mom, it's just a tree, really." But she said, "Oh, no, you should read more about it." And, so it didn't contaminate my work to find out more about it, but I was just sort of instinctively, or she would say just naturally, using certain symbols that occur to many people. And that's in some ways, I hope, why my work appeals to people. The tree was a screen print, and that's why I had an ortho, actually I had an ortho positive of it rather than a negative. And I had learned to make screen prints, photo screen prints at Penland School in North Carolina. And they were expensive too, making a screen, making the orthofilm, all of that. So I didn't make a lot, but one that I used again and again was this tree. The film that was used to make it, and also the screen print itself, which is how I made this drawing.
I'm interested in your mother pointing out these archetypes and these symbols, and particularly here, it just sort of occurred to me just this morning that Medusa, those who gaze into her eyes turn to stone, and here you're staring, and who are you turning to stone?
I'm not sure, but I'd say don't mess with me.
I would say that too. I just wonder.
Go
ahead. Well, it seems like with the challenges you were having in your graduate program at the time, and it seems like almost a provocation in some way to those who might have been reviewing your work or maybe in some critiques.
Yeah, this was pre-feminism, pre any real recognition I had of. It wasn't something that people were, I mean, I'm sure people were writing about it, but it wasn't hot in school at that point. This is 1969. There was other things we were worrying about, Vietnam, all those sorts of things. The feminist movement didn't really pick up steam till the mid 70s. So the images that of mine that were self-portraits were not always a critique, but sometimes they were.
Mm-hmm. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but for you and for a number of other women who were making self-portraiture at the time, I think you're often asked, why the self-portrait to symbolize maybe a universally recognized figure? And the answer is often, I was available. I was home. It was the most practical thing. I didn't have to pay myself. Mm-hmm. And that's also a reason to often use family members and friends. And that's not the only reason. Often it's intentional and meaningful, but sometimes it's just you need a person who can fit the bill for the particular image you're trying to make. And often that's yourself.
You got it. That's why I use myself so much. And also my sister Connie appears in a lot of images, Elizabeth also, and they are there in their own right, but also there's enough family resemblance that they are representing me at an innocent stage in my life, at an earlier stage in my life. And, they were cooperative. You don't see very many pictures, for example, of my brothers. I have two brothers as well. Mm-hmm. But because of the connection between these little girls, who there were 7 and 10 years younger than me, in an autobiographical sort of way, I used them. Not a lot. Again, they're repeated images of Connie that you'll see.
Right. Well, and I'd like to just show this work you've titled Peacock. This is a later, a good 5 years later, Cyanotype and Van Dyke, but we see that negative, one of the negatives from time and travel is here on the right. That's right. The self-portrait there. And we're also seeing other symbols or other kind of just images, the water. There are birds that appear a lot of Florida imagery that evokes kind of, I think, for you, your childhood and growing up there. So we start to gather up these symbols that we start to recognize and predict we'll see again. And here's an example of those appearing later. I'd like to go back to the summer between your first and second years of graduate school to talk about another transition is not quite the right word, an issue you faced and how you sort of overcame it, but something that became very integral to your work. And this is when you started stitching photographs. And I'm very interested in how practical solutions can open up new avenues. And so from what I understand, there were various limitations you faced in terms of access to equipment, but one particular one was at one point you were locked out of the room where you could use the dry mount press. And at that time, that's how you would adhere a thin gelatin silver paper or other kind of thin paper to a board so that it could be presented and put up on a print rail. And so you, that summer, just started sewing gelatin silver prints to the board. If I can't dry mount it, I'll just sew them right on. And so I'm interested in the thinking there, but I also want to look at some examples. We can take, for example, Landscape Pocket. This is a work that's now at the Portland Art Museum, but you made it in June 1969, so that's that summer between. And then there's another example here, M's Hidden Lake, also 1969.
Well, I learned to sew when I was about 7 on a sewing machine, first on a treadle machine from one grandmother, but that wasn't electric. So I went over to my other grandmother and started using electric sewing machines. So and that grandmother Noble, had a studio right in her dining room. And she was probably a very frustrated artist who rarely went out of her home environment. And I had seen her, she actually stitched little paper booklets together in a sewing machine. So I knew you could sew paper. I'd seen that as a kid. She also laced up Clorox bottles to make lampshades. I mean, some of it was pretty awful stuff, but at any rate, when I was in grad school, the first things I sewed were actually paintings. And I was making a quilt, a regular quilt, because I was cold. It was my first winter in Illinois. And I started with a regular quilt. And then I thought, I could quilt my paintings together. I'm going to try that. And the first ones were very conservative, square. And then I thought, why do that? Just make the painting out of fabric. So we can show the Skirted Garden. That was one of the most successful paintings that I made entirely with fabric. And then I thought, wow, this is really cool. I want to do my etchings on fabric. And then, suddenly it occurred to me, well, photos would work because I've seen that, I know that can be done. As long as I stick to 2-ply mount board, I have a pretty tough little sewing machine. I can sew these things directly to 2-ply board and avoid having to make a special trip and a big deal to go over and use the dry mount press. So that was sort of a tangential reason, the dry mount press, but it was a bonus. It meant that I could attach these things and make them. And then I started actually cutting the photos physically up. But prior to that, all the piecing together had been seamless, pretty much. So the very first stitched photo is Landscape Pocket. I distinctly remember that was the first one. And those are both Florida images. And then the M's Hidden Lake, it's almost the same thing, except M, it refers to Puerto Rico, a trip that I made to Puerto Rico, but also down south. So I combined these different toned photos to create these. And that was the summer. Also, if you move to evening, the image evening is a further use of stitching.
We should just say how outrageous it was at the time to be sewing into
Yes.
photographs. It was a really, I would say, provocative thing to do.
Yeah.
At the time.
And again, I wasn't thinking of it as a provocative thing. It just seemed like a natural way to work, to piece things together. And again, before feminism, before, Miriam, before these people were making quilts, and maybe they were, and I wasn't aware of it, because also I never had a female teacher,
Right.
a studio teacher in the whole 6 years of my education. So it was not a subject that was brought up. And actually very little contemporary art history. I had a little bit, but what I picked up, I had to pick up pretty much on my own.
Your sisters and your mother figure into your work a great deal, but I would like to also just ask about your father.
There's a picture, an image I use a lot of myself doing a little cat's cradle with my fingers, and my 2 brothers and my mother, beautiful, holding the family group. We're leaning up against a car. And that was a family portrait. My dad was the family photographer. And again, we didn't own a camera back then, but he would bring home a Speed Graflex camera from the university. And that was loaded actually with 4x5 film. And he took portraits and we got to see them. And then eventually he realized I was fascinated and interested. And so he took me over to the darkroom at the University of Florida in the freezer lab where they kept vegetables. It was freezing cold, but that's where they had a little darkroom for the ag department. And that's where I first saw a photograph printed, and it was, incredible. He also, he knew that I was going to take photography eventually as a painting student, and he bought me my Yashica twin reflex camera, probably even in my sophomore year, way before I knew how to use it or could use it, because that's the camera that would be used. So he was very, very encouraging of photography and family pictures and all of that. Not to mention the love of plants, because he was an ag professor and my mother loved gardening. They both gardened quite a bit. I'd say I'm probably more into the range of things that I grow, but certainly he was an expert vegetable crops guy, and I learned a lot that way too.
There are a number of works you made around 1970, maybe still in grad school, maybe shortly after, that seem to be in a very earthy color palette that's very different from the work that I know best of yours, which seems to be brightly colored. And I just wonder if that has anything to do with this shared family interest in, well, your father's expertise in agriculture, but also your family's gardening and this real kind of connection to the earth.
Not maybe so much as just more general, but when I first got to Illinois and saw the black soil, it flipped me out. It is so rich up here. It still does in the spring, to go out and see the fields that have been plowed and that black soil. Florida is more of a sandy soil. It's a gray and a real loose sand soil, at least where I grew up. And it's flat. Florida's flatter than Illinois, if you can believe it. So the flatness wasn't an issue, although I love the horizons that I could. There are fewer trees here. There's less of a canopy. That you saw in some of the earlier prints, where there's a tremendous amount of growth coming down from above. The canopy is something that is very prevalent in Florida that isn't so prevalent here in Illinois. So it always, when I did that, I'm really referencing home, the swamp, the growth, and so forth. When it's a flat out horizon and clouds, it's more of the Illinois landscape. I didn't respond to Illinois other than that too much. And I think you do tend to bond with where you were raised, the plants of your childhood and just the landscape. If you had a long childhood in one place, which I did. The main places that I like to photograph in Illinois, and the imagery that ends up in the work, other than the black soil, are some of those garden statues, like the Venus. I think you already pointed that out, and certain classical bits of architecture and formal gardens. That's a place that's quite unique, called Allerton Park. It was owned by a rich Chicago industrialist, and he set up a Versailles out in the middle of nowhere, that he would take a train car and take his friends from Chicago, and they would wander around in this mini Versailles that he built. He also retired to Kauai in Hawaii, and so that I've been to both his gardens, and I loved Allerton Park, and I would go out there often once a week, just as an escape from grad school and to photograph.
Maybe to sort of lead on to the next kind of phase as you're starting to finish graduate school. Around this time, correct me if I'm wrong, but you had been stitching into paper photographs, but you had been looking for ways to actually print onto fabric so that the stitching, to sort of bring that together, and finally sort of found a supply of photo linen and worked out the details. And I'm sure you tried other things too. That's not, the only thing you did, but it seemed that you found some success kind of stretching photo linen almost like a canvas, and then making these framed, smaller, really lovely kind of landscapes with the horizon, as you've mentioned, and a couple of objects that reflect or sort of reference maybe 19th century cased objects that open, but you've got this sort of stretched linen over both sides. And this is work you were doing by the time or around the time that in the spring of 1970, you're just getting ready to graduate. You're still in touch with Robert Fichter. You find out, or he tells you, or everybody knows that SPE, Society for Photographic Education, is going to be meeting in Indianapolis. That's not so far from where you are. Robert's going to be there. You can catch up with him, maybe meet some of his contacts. And so you go to SPE and you do see him. And this seems to be a wonderful event for you, a wonderful sort of domino effect, because Robert Fichter, of course, I'm very interested in sort of this Rochester scene that was happening in the 60s. And he came out of, early on, he was one of Henry Holmes Smith's students, recommended to ultimately work at the Eastman House in the 60s doing, I think he was one of the guys out in the shed preparing traveling exhibitions in the cold for Nathan Lyons and working with Nathan. I've interviewed Robert about this time, and he didn't overlap very much with Harold Jones. Harold Jones kind of came in when Robert left, but Harold Jones had also been there as a fellow one summer when Robert was there. So he wasn't there as an employee, but so Harold and Robert knew each other really well. Peter Bunnell had worked at the Eastman House in summers. He worked directly with Nathan on Photography 64. So there's this whole combination of people that had gone through Rochester that now you're meeting at SPE. And Robert Fichter, holds up the slides, you're showing Robert, and then he just kind of passes them down the line. And suddenly you have a show at Eastman House because Harold's there. You didn't even know he was a curator there. And then you kind of have a show pretty soon at you are included in a show, or you get the interest of Peter Bunnell, who's looking for more people to be in photography and sculpture, a landmark show in 1970. So suddenly you haven't even finished graduation yet, but the dice are kind of all rolling in your favor. And so we can look at those kind of photo linen pieces as the ones that were selected, a couple of pieces that, luckily you figured out those materials and sort of how to do that, because those are the pieces that ended up in photography into sculpture. And then, just months later, because Harold wanted you to finish graduate school before he gave you a solo show at a major institution, you then also had another exhibition, shortly after, called Images and Swamp Dreams. What did that feel like? That must have been a very exciting time.
Sure.
Just 1970.
I thought I had it made. I thought I had it made. This was the way it worked. You show in New York, you show in the biggest photo museum, and then the rest would be simple. And actually, there were many things like that started to fall together. But I always tell people I was ready. I had work. I had a lot of work, and I had interesting work.
And then Harold Jones, who organized your exhibition, what must have been one of the last things he did at the Eastman House, is then sort of handpicked to go be the founding director of Light Gallery in New York the next year. And he has to identify sort of who's going to be my first stable of artists. And he invites you as the only woman, I believe, amongst 12 other artists that are going to be the artists sort of represented and shown there. And you're part of some group shows right away, but then in 1972, in May, so a year and a half after this Eastman House show, you have a solo exhibition called Heart Attacks and Photo Fantasies. And the title Heart Attacks and Photo Fantasies gives a hint to people, I think, of what's going to be sort of a thematic, something that unites the works thematically. Could you tell us a little bit in general what the exhibition, what the theme was and what had been going on in your life a couple of years ahead of time? And then I really want to talk about the Kool-Aid hearts, because we've acquired one of these.
Okay, that's a lot. I need to go back to Rochester to the key influences and include my husband, Lionel Suntop, who was at that point starting up Light Impressions. Very important influence for many people because of his passion for books. He knew a lot about books. We owned a lot of photo books. They distributed photo books, and everyone who came to town came to see Lionel and his partner to show them their book project. So there was a tremendous outpouring of bookmaking and book technology and so forth, not just, Joan printing at the VSW, but people getting things printed elsewhere in the country. And so that was amazing. Now, Lionel didn't come to the opening because I don't think he either got an invitation, but he eventually saw my show. He had met me in the fall when I first arrived, trying to sell me books for the library. And that's when I first met him. And I said, I'm going to have this show at the Eastman Museum, and some of these pieces will be in it. They were in my office, and it just knocked him out. He'd never seen anything like it. So he did go see the show. And then he told Nathan about it, because Lionel at that point was one of Nathan's students. And so there's that. But at that point, when I met Lionel, I was dating someone else. And it wasn't until that guy left me for another woman that I was free to start to see Lionel. And we're still married, okay? That point, though, was when the heart started to enter my work. Specifically, in many cases, a broken heart, because this, everyone goes through relationships, but this was a really severe breakup for me. It shattered my all of my confidence in what I thought was going to happen. And so there's a lot of images of broken hearts. So it was a theme for quite some time in the work, and it eventually found its way into the actual show name, Heart Attacks and Photo Fantasies, at Light Gallery, my first and only one-person show there. So you'd get off the elevator and you were confronted with this row of hearts that were filled with fluid. And I called them the Kool-Aid Heart series. And there were 8 of them. And there were different young women at various ages, starting with really little young girls. Like there's one of me at about 10 years old. Actually, it was one that my dad took. It's that same camera that he brought home and did family portraits of. They were just wonderful negatives, and he gave me the negatives and I was able to use them. And one of Connie, a couple of Elizabeth, as younger women, as more innocent women. And then as you progress with the series, they become Black Cherry and Cherry, and they look a lot harsher. And those are grown women. And I didn't consciously do it that way, except for the aging. I did consciously think about that. But the fact that they were red, I realized later, was referencing something I really came to terms with much later in my work, more in the 80s and 90s, is menstruation. Okay, so this is, heaven forbid, it's menstrual blood, okay, in the last couple of Kool-Aid Hearts.
The one we've acquired is one that you showed. So in 1972, after finishing a year of teaching at RIT, you get a job at Tyler in Philadelphia, and there was a faculty show, and you showed 2 hearts there.
Right.
You've told this story in The Skirted Garden and elsewhere, but briefly, just tell us what happened to this object, because here, our object that we own looks as if it's seen some excitement. Tell us what happened.
It did. It's amazing. Yeah, I had 2 of them filled with fluid. They were technically made with vinyl and sealed with a dry mount tacker, melted just to the point where the 2 pieces of vinyl would adhere. And through the top, I with a syringe or something, a squirt bottle, I filled them with colored liquid. It wasn't Kool-Aid actually, but it was dyed fluid. And then I stitched it shut and put it on a 2-ply board. Okay, so they're pretty fragile objects, and they were framed in plexiglass box type frames. So I put 2 of them in the show. I was a new faculty member, still quite a young person at Tyler. And I come to the opening all dolled up, and I walk over to see my work, and both of them have been broken. They've been smashed by curious people. I don't think it was like malicious or anything. They just, is this liquid? Oh yeah, it's liquid. It ran right down the picture, which shows on the one you've got, onto the wall in little puddles on the floor. So it's kind of like like a happening or something,
Yeah.
you know? But everyone was staring at me, you know, like how this is our new gallery space. We just painted it, you know, how could you do such a thing? You know, I didn't mean it to happen, but this happens sometimes in my work. Audience participation, I kind of like that. Tempting somebody so much, like the skirted garden, tempting people to lift the skirt and see what's under it, shake something and change its position. Touch, books are really good that way. Some of my books have transparencies, and when you change and handle them, they change. I like that. Not necessarily I like when things get broken, but you know, that's the way it goes sometimes.
Well, let's look at the other object that's kind of related to this. And I'm showing very briefly a variant, a sort of a piece of what ends up being in the work that we've purchased, just so people can get sort of a larger view. So I just want to briefly show Lake Lady from February 1970. It's not exactly the same combination of negatives, but here you are, again, emerging from the water in a bathing suit as Venus here. And so everybody just get a good look at sort of what's going on in this picture, because then in this work called Leftovers, we see a different landscape negative, but joined with the same negative of your figure there. But this time the photograph itself is stitched and placed inside a sandwich bag, along with kind of a scrap of yarn that can move around, isn't entirely functional, and is in fact intended to give the impression of not having a purpose, being sort of a leftover, just a discard, right?
Yeah.
And from what I understand, that's kind of the theme of this piece. These are leftovers because after that breakup you experienced, you felt like a leftover, just sort of discarded like a piece of yarn or a sandwich bag. Can you tell us a little bit more about this work? And were there others like this? And was this in that show, Heart Attacks and Photo Fantasies, or is this just something you did around the same time?
I did it around the same time. And I think, you know, you summarized it really well. The little pink, it's just fluff. It's basically a trim of some sort, like a seamstress might throw on the floor and vacuum up later. So it's just debris in a way. And so that's what I was trying to express. It's technically not truly a Ziploc bag. It's like a sandwich bag, but you know, it's the idea that this is where you would put leftovers. And I never did another thing like it.
Maybe this is a good moment to just say a little bit more about water in your photographs. We've mentioned it, and I think people who are familiar with your work sort of take for granted that it's frequently there and part of your life as you grew up. But it's not just sort of literal lakes because you grew up around lakes or water. You often use myths that involve water. And recreate imagery, and often you're standing in for a particular figure who is associated with a water myth or a fairy tale or some kind of magical thing happening around the water. And so as long as we've brought up Lake Lady, even though the leftover context is very different, but if we go back to this idea of the Lake Lady, who is a made up kind of character that you've created, could you talk about those different iterations and what that all symbolized for you?
Sure. There are 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And earth and water are considered the feminine elements. And honestly, I am more attracted to those 2 elements. I have almost never done anything dealing with fire, for example. I've done images to a certain extent with air and clouds and airplane trails and, you know, looking up, but really I'm quite focused in my preferences towards earth and water. And actually this goes back again to undergrad school when you talked earlier about a color palette that I used in my paintings. I had one professor who'd say, you know, your paintings wouldn't be so bad if you would just quit using these colors, and try something, whatever. And I told my mother that, and she says, honey, get right down in the dirt. She says, that's what you know. And we used to always talk about, we played in the mud a lot, my brothers and I, but a good, clean dirt, nothing wrong with good, clean dirt. And so earth and water are very, very important, and probably more fresh water than oceans. Although I grew up in Florida, mainly I grew up in and around lakes and fresh water. So there's a lot of lakes in the work, references to lakes. We had a lake house. I spent half my life in the water or underwater. That's the only way you could keep cool. Again, pre-air conditioning, what's a kid to do? It's 90 degrees all the time, but stay wet, which we did. If at some point we talk about Lake Lady, Neptune and Lake Lady, that's a good example of the importance of above water and below water also.
I think this is a really good moment to talk about Lake Lady and maybe that particular myth. Maybe talk about this book as an example of the kinds of notebook books you were experimenting with at the time.
All right. I didn't have a clue how to bind a book, but I wanted to do that. I had worked on a book at some point right in here of my mother's poetry and my imagery. And so the first one was a notebook. And then people kept saying, oh, it'd be really nice to have one. I said, fat chance, this thing took 6 months to make. I'm not going to do that. But the fact that I had already begun to make these 3-ring binder collage notebooks led me to keep making more. And the other thing, it was, again, a practical solution. When I first started teaching at Nazareth College in 1970, I was teaching 5 course preparations. These were 1 credit, 2 credit courses. And I'd never taught. So I was extremely busy, but I wanted to do studio work, and I'd go home and I'd be pretty wiped out, but I would go to the studio and work on a collage. I figured I could do that much. I didn't have much space either. So space was an issue, time, money, all of that. The Neptune series was actually done before the breakup with this man that I considered my Neptune. And it prefigures that breakup, but I didn't know it was going to happen. And it's so obvious when you look at all the pages, like when you get to Lake Lady Legs, that's Lake Lady, that's me emerging from this underwater zone alone. In the beginning, I'm being seduced. That first image is me as Lake Lady by the edge of the water, and this large figure of Neptune coming up and kind of talking me into going down under the water and engaging, which I do in various ways in the book. And then at the end, I float up out. And by the time that image was done and put away, it wasn't more than a month or 2 before he left me for somebody else. So I instinctively, I knew it. And that only happens occasionally in artwork for me. And it's incredibly wonderful when it does happen. Of course, even when there's something bad that happens, nevertheless, there's something playing in the back of my mind which feeds into the work. And that's the most exciting thing.
At Tyler, it seems like, again, you're sort of adapting to the resources available to you and what's practical to you, and you're starting to print books. And to go back to those elements you were talking about, water and earth and sky and fire, you do a book called Events in the Sky and another one, Events in the Water. And I believe those were projects you were working on when you were
at Tyler.
At Tyler. And in 1974, we talked about Lionel. He had been working away at Light Impressions in Rochester. You evidently stayed in touch and wanted to get married in 1974, and you returned to Rochester and did that. And At first, I believe you didn't really have a job lined up, but you were an artist in residence at VSW for a time, did some teaching, and also printed some books there. So experimented a little bit more with the equipment that they had, and was able to kind of, you were able to kind of, VSW, we know, was a pretty loose place where there was a lot of encouragement or ability. If you had an idea and they had the equipment, you'd figure it out and you could kind of make it happen. It was informal in those days, even though a lot of serious work was going on. I don't mean to sound it was not an organized place to be, but the attitude was not to put up roadblocks. The attitude was more art, more better, let's do it. Sure, do you know how to use that press? Okay, that kind of a thing. So it seems like that was another step. And you've mentioned that at Light Impressions too, you also got experience not only seeing a great range of what was happening in artist books at the time, but also printing, learning, how to put your own ideas into form. And this is also kind of leading me, if you came back to Rochester in 74, 75 is the year you finished your Mountain Dream Tarot.
Yeah.
And that is a project you'd been working on for 5 years, since the summer in Penland.
Okay. The very first image in the tarot deck was myself as the Queen of Pentacles, because I found this awesome dress that was covered with stars, and stars were sort of a personal icon at that point in time. I had another friend, we put stars on everything. So finding this dress was great. And I took this self-portrait. The star in my lap was actually painted there. It wasn't in the original portrait. And after I did that, I thought, and again, this is one of those subconscious things, I sort of started making a tarot deck. I didn't wake up that morning knowing that's what I was going to do. Someone had suggested the Arthur Waite book when I was in grad school, and I bought a copy because she knew I liked symbolism, and I was very interested in the symbolism because it's based on earth, air, fire, and water, and there's just much you can learn from just the symbolic use. But there's numerology, there's all sorts of things that go on in tarot cards. So I asked another person to model for me that same morning. I believe it was the Magician card. And then I started after lunch thinking, well, I'll try another one of these. And then it became rather addictive and fun. And I was at Penland School. There were a lot of artists and craftspeople around, and they were willing to dress up. I'd show them the drawing and say, this is who you're going to be. And then they would sit and we'd work it out. But that was it. And I don't know how many I shot that summer. Eventually, I started enlisting my family. And then I went back to Penland several times. So it took 5 years, not continuous at all, but always sort of checking it off my list as I would get a card done. Now, again, you got to try to put your brain back to pre-Photoshop. Okay, so if there's a sword flying through the air, you probably threw it through the air, or if something on fire, it was on fire. That's what I always say. And finally got it done in 1975. And by that point, I had enough offset printing knowledge and expertise to actually go to a place called Mohawk Press in Rochester and commission the card deck to be printed. And then I cut them up, I rounded the corners, I glued the labels on the boxes, and I made 1,000 of them. And this is again where Light Impressions is a key player, because you make 1,000, and how do you sell 1,000?
Right.
It's really one thing to make a bunch of books. It's another to sell them and not keep them in your garage. And they were really good with all the books that I produced in trying to list them in their mail order catalog. And of course, I always sold them when I traveled too, but that's what was really of key importance, was distribution.
In the tarot deck, that photograph of you in that star dress appears again in a number of places, including an exhibition that you hung at light impressions, actually, where you are wearing the dress and you are representing the sky goddess Nut, the Egyptian goddess, who sort of covers the earth with her body, and the stars, it becomes the sort of cover of night. That image appears again in a work you made and that we bought here in 2010 called Moon Dreams. And this is the summer of 75. You're in Rochester. You haven't yet started teaching at RIT again. I think that was the following, I think that was 76, perhaps, around there.
Right, I'd have to check.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you did just a very short, compressed kind of body of work that summer, of course, because you could expose these outside in printing frames and you didn't have kind of institutional affiliation. Maybe you could have kind of used some of the things at VSW, but it's easier to do this outside in printing frames. So in your backyard, you did a series of cyanotypes, often layered with Van Dyke, which has an impact on the cyanotype, often kind of bleaching it back out. And there's interaction between all of that chemistry and then applied color, different kinds of paints, different kinds of washes over that. And we are lucky enough to own a really complicated one with a lot going on. And I showed this here at the Ransom Center a few years ago and kind of asked you about all of these different layers. We've got the unicorn from the sort of tapestries at the cloisters. We've got a knight. We've got you as Nut a few times. We've got a starburst. We've got a tree with kind of this, what almost looks like you set your coffee cup down on it, but I'm sure it's an intentional circle. And so we have all of these kinds of symbols all at once. And I'm just wondering if we could talk about how these all interact in this image. How are all of these coming together and what does it all mean?
Good luck with that.
Thank you. I was hoping you could help.
It's not just you. I think the coffee cup thing is probably meant to be a moon and the other opposite is the sun. So there's a little bit of daytime, nighttime thing going. And then the unicorn, you can even see it just over your shoulder, you know, it really pops. So it is, yeah, about the unicorn, and then myself sort of as a fairy figure circulating around it. Not a lot of heavy meaning, frankly, so you didn't miss it. But it was in the days when I made these images, and I only made a dozen of these large cyanotypes in 75. It was in the days when I had lots of small pieces of orthofilm. Some of them I used in screen printing. Some of them I used for other purposes, but often, you know, I just kept them and I would lay them out and try to make compositions that way. The aesthetic in the work changes a lot when we start to talk about the flamingo in the dark work, and even more so the 80s work called Close to Home, when I could afford really big pieces of orthofilm. And that, again, it's an economic thing, but at that point, RIT through Kodak would give the faculty subvention funds, and I would use it to buy really large sheets of film, which changed the way my images look. So going back to this one, I had lots of small images, and with a cyanotype such as this also has a bit of Van Dyke brown as well. You get a one shot. You make it and you can't move it. You can't do much more. And then probably, this is a long time ago, probably once I made the cyanotype, then I painted some of the Van Dyke solution, which bleaches out the cyanotype, and added a little bit more to it just to sort of subdue what was going on. And then there's a bit of hand coloring.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So even though you only made a dozen, as you say, or somewhere around there, they all seem very, very complex and layered and labor intensive. And I know that printing outside can be a very, I don't want to say unscientific because it's quite chemical and you can kind of predict times, but there's no sometimes it's 25 minutes, sometimes it's an hour. You kind of have to look at the clouds. You kind of have to do your own calculations. And it can be frustrating when you wait an hour and you've done all of this careful work and then it doesn't turn out. So just because you made 12 doesn't really mean you only tried 12 times. And anyway, we talked about this work a few months ago in the context of just kind of talking about different projects. And I kind of thought to myself and then said out loud, like, that was a great year, 1975. You did this tarot project, but then also all of these. And you just very easily, quickly said, well, yeah, I didn't have kids yet. And I want you to kind of hold that thought, because that's something I want to address as we move on in this interview. And to do this, I always try to look at what people like you, what artists said about their work and their life at the time they were making the work that I'm acquiring or that I'm writing about. So there's a way you might talk about it now, but then if I can find an interview you did right at the moment or some lecture you gave or something, that often tells me what you were thinking at the time. And ultimately, you may have learned more about even what you were doing later, which might be equally accurate or more insightful, but I still want to know what you were trying to do. And so one of my very favorite sources for this is this wonderful book by Tom Dugan, Photography Between Covers. And he was interviewing photo book makers. And he was being really intentionally aware of what a photo book was as a piece of art, not just photography books that were, kind of extended calendar picture books or, because there were plenty of those for popular audiences, but these were artists making books. And you and Joan Lyons were the only two women included in this, but it's a wonderful series of interviews published in 1979. And the interviews start as early as 73 or 74. And it took him years to kind of interview all of these people. I just want to open with a bit of entertainment that might give you a sense of why I kind of love this book, because he never just started the interview with the conversation. He never transcribed just the interview and that's all you get. He would often always start with kind of his impressions of the person, his impression of you. Bea Nettles projects an image of a woman aware of her destiny and in charge of her life. Which is he interviewed you on January 2nd, 1978. And I think that, the women's movement is heating up at this time. I don't know that that's why he's saying that, but it's a wonderful kind of a statement at the time. And I think in the interview, he asks some of the same questions or brings up some of the things we were talking about earlier just now about how, you brought your talent to bear, but also it almost seemed like you willed things into place, like these things just kept happening at the right time. And he seemed to think it was this kind of force you had, this kind of, he didn't go so far as to say mystical, but kind of like you made things happen. And these interviews are just, I think, really revealing of the attitudes of the interviewer and the interviewee at the time. But okay, that said, one of the things that he asks you about is, he mentions that you had received recently, this is 78, a CAPS grant. And he asks you if you've been able to get any other funding, and you say no. And he says, have you applied? And you say no. And then there's kind of this ellipsis where he's trying to indicate that a few moments had passed. And then you said, well, my problem is I'm on this borderline between media. The photographers see my work and say it's painting. The painters see my work and say it's photography. And the funding agencies are set up in these same categories as well, where I just don't seem to be able to get any traction between the camps. And I think that we've talked about this a little bit, but I often think that you certainly, and you say this to Tom Dugan, you've had this has been a challenge for you, but also at the beginning in 1970, it seems like it worked in your favor because, photography into sculpture was this moment where you had to be doing that kind of work to be in that show. And that's so unusual for people doing work like you, who were often excluded just because you didn't fit in one place or another. And so you're saying this in 1978, did you have that experience? Do you feel like you still have that experience? When did you sort of stop feeling like you were getting stonewalled by one or the other?
That's a really good question. I believe people don't worry about it so much anymore. This was something actually Lee Whitkin took Betty Hahn and I aside one time. We were sitting in his gallery, and he said, you women really shouldn't be showing in photo galleries. You should be in a painting gallery or another kind of gallery. And I think both of us knew that it's a small pond. The photo area at that point was a small pond, and the art area was a very big pond. And so I certainly wasn't going to go out and try to get into a painting gallery with my work, but that was his opinion, even back that far. But I think the siloing days have quit. I don't really feel like everyone has to prove that they're pure. And photo in the early days really did feel like they had to show that they were serious, and photo was art, and it should be compensated, and people should be able to sell their work for a fair price and so forth. At the early light gallery shows, we were just amazed that our work was selling for, $75 a print or something, as opposed to like $10 or something. It was an effort by Harold, and it was wonderful, that they were trying to get a lot more respect for photography. And certainly my work probably irritated a lot of people because it could be seen as pictorialist, the gum printing, the print, the earlier conflict that people had with early photography trying to look too painterly and historically.
Right.
I don't think people mind now at all.
Well, what a relief.
Yeah.
Well, I want to look at another thing that Tom Dugan asked you. And I thought your answer, while completely innocuous, made me really laugh, because I know what happened after this. But so again, this is January 2nd, 1978. And he asks you what your immediate plans are. And you said, well, I'm having a baby. So that's really going to change my immediate plans. And you say it's going to probably occupy you for most of that summer coming up. And while it all sounds kind of hilarious, and we might think, oh, Bea, it's going to occupy you the rest of your life. Actually, it's a little bit amazing, because you say in that interview that you're hoping to get more funding, and you did, to publish a book of these works you had been putting together, these quick prints, this kind of modern day gum print. And you were going to apply for funding, and you did get an NEA grant the next year for this in 1979. Between the time you're talking to him, you have a baby, and you get funding, and you actually physically, the book is a thing within 2 years. And so it wasn't so funny after all. And so I want to talk a little bit about, for people who aren't familiar, and again, everybody should be looking at your wonderful monograph here for all kinds of in-depth information and all the other books you've published about your own work. But maybe we could just look at this work called Rocket, 1976, which is not part of Flamingo in the Dark, but is a quick print that you were doing at that time. And maybe just briefly tell us about the kind of labor involved in producing one of these objects, and what maybe spin you were putting on it based on maybe your mother's cleaning habits, for example, or other kind of personal influences into the process.
Okay, looking at this image, I can tell you that there's at least 4 negatives involved in it. The rocket is the size that you see. All these are contact printed negatives. So the rocket would have been shot and cut out as a little shape, and the moon would have been shot and probably at a planetarium or something and cut out as a shape. And then there's some landscape textures, the surface of the moon, those sorts of things. There are large sheets of orthofilm. Okay, so quick print, first of all, we got to back up.
Yes.
So you know what I'm talking about. Quick print with a K, which I always say it's with a K and not with a Q because it's not quick. Okay. And again, there's a YouTube video that I did years ago where I'm holding up negatives and holding up quick prints and explaining the technical. So I don't want to go into it too much, but it was a bichromated color fluid that was somewhat sticky and light sensitive, and it would be coated onto a sheet of vinyl with a cotton pad. So it'd be buffed on to the surface and it would dry just like that. And because it's vinyl, there was no shrinkage or curling or anything. Then you'd lay the negative down, contact print it with a bright light, take it into a water bath and rinse off the unexposed color. And voila, you have one color flat image on the vinyl. And then you could keep applying, dry it, then you could keep applying more color, either on the same spot and use more exposure, less exposure with the same negative, or other things, masking and so forth. My mother's cleaning trick, she used Ajax for everything. And house cleaning in the summer was kind of like a Tom Sawyer event. All the neighborhood kids wanted to help because it looked like so much fun, but she used Ajax. She even used it behind my little brother Jack's ears to clean his ears. But I knew Ajax was a good material, and I would shake it on some of these prints and scrub. And that way I could scrub some color off and get much more of a nuance. It was not as flat. It had more of a coming and going. That also is something that I learned because of my art background with scraping and burning and burnishing rather in printmaking and painting too for certain, you know, you would paint something and then you paint over it or you'd rub it off with a cloth or whatever. So I wasn't content just to put a color and leave it. I nuanced it somewhat. Okay. So I would build them up till I felt like they were done. And the iconography in the rocket one is sort of, it's just really a humorous print. It wasn't meant to be heavy. It was a child's space ride. You'd put money in the box and sit in there and it would probably shake you around. And I imagine that this was also when there was more NASA stuff going on in the news and it, I'm not saying the spacewalk going on the moon was ridiculous, but I think some of the other stuff is it uses a lot of resources we could use other ways, frankly. And so it's a rickety kind of rocket to the moon. And many references, you know, early movies, the fascination in going to the moon, and the moon itself in my work is a big of great importance because of the moon's association with women and the menstrual cycle as well.
Well, and your work doesn't shy away from women's bodies and from sexuality. And in that context here, we have the meeting of the moon, which is a feminine symbol, with a rocket, which we could read as a masculine symbol as well.
Sure.
Moving to the kind of selection of these works you made for Flamingo in the Dark, this becomes sort of it becomes autobiographical, starting from your youth all the way until the birth of your first child, Rachel, in 1978, the one we've been talking about while you were being interviewed. You were awaiting the arrival of her shortly after. And throughout the book we have, and this might be, you tell me, but this might be another instance in which a lot of the quick prints you made starting in 1976 sort of indicate perhaps a subconscious readying of yourself to have your first child or to decide to have a first child, whether it was conscious or not, because we see again images of you as a woman now, and there are images of the moon. You are a moon. There are many images, almost all of the images somehow focus on round shapes and very feminine shapes. We've got this moon portrait, which Is that Neptune off to the left in a very tall, very
I
tiny
don't think so. It's
statue?
just a guy off in the corner staring at me, but
Okay.
I'm,
Okay.
it is, there's the male female thing. There's definitely a man in the picture, and that's me as a full moon, which is a fertile woman, the belly reflecting that, the rounded belly, and that those arms raised again, which I said I do a fair amount, a dead on confrontational, ready to do whatever you do look. And that's all about getting pregnant. Not so much as another image called Bird's Nest, which was another one of those wow moments. I made that image and it was one of my favorites. And it's got me sort of as a sky goddess, the new goddess, looking over a nest with eggs in it. And there's a moon stand-in, which is actually a clock face. And I realized later it was the biological clock in the sky waiting for me to nest. And that I wasn't pregnant then, but I was thinking about it on an unconscious kind of level when I made that image. So I would say this one falls somewhat into that same category, minus the biological clock.
And we have sea oats, which is clearly you've crossed that barrier. Here we have an image of pregnancy, and perhaps I don't know if there are two different versions of you here, two different negatives. One, you're clearly pregnant. I don't know if the other one you've realized you're pregnant or not, or if this is before.
Way before, much
Okay.
like many years before, a slender young thing, and then a pregnant, probably 6-7 months pregnant there. And this image, it's by the sea and there's birds and so forth, but it's really about the contrast in those two figures. And then to me, I'm always conscious of negative space and just the beautiful way that that they line up, just formally. And this particular image is pretty gutsy for me. I don't tend to show myself in the nude very often, but I felt in that book and in the context of what I was going through that it was important. It is in the book, and it's right in there prior to Rachel in the Pines, and where she actually is a done deal.
Well, and it looks here like, I mean, this is such an interesting image. But the first two things I immediately focused in on are one, the mother has converged with the earth. So there's this conflation of the earth and the mother, but also this kind of fun photo history trope where mothers are always sort of covered in a blanket holding the baby in the chair so the baby doesn't move, for the kind of 19th century studio portrait photographer.
Yes, the mother is pretty much obliterated except for that hand, which I really liked. And I'm there for a practical reason. You can see why the Victorians had to do it, especially when the exposures had to be so long. But honestly, I was not even thinking of those Victorian pictures. It wasn't for years that came up as something someone was collecting, and I was just flipped out by those. I really like them, but I didn't even remember that happening in this work. It was Olivia Los Gonzalez who pointed that out in the essay in the book, the Harvest book. Now the nursing one is just a really lovely, sweet image of me nursing her, and nursing is a really amazing experience, incredible experience. But that's the only image I did of that process, and it's pretty private. I don't think I've ever shown it.
Just to round out the ones that we've acquired, I also want to take a look at moms, and I'm interested in the use of the sort of duplication of the photograph of you being held by your mother and then you holding your daughter, and the kind of insertion of a vernacular photograph, presumably taken by your father, though I have not verified that with you.
It probably was up. It would have been in Ithaca, New York. when he was finishing his PhD at Cornell. And I would have been probably 3 years old, maybe.
So there's this really lovely kind of repetition of the trope of the mother holding the child in front of the home, and the home even looks a little bit similarly clad in this kind of siding. But something you said to me very recently, perhaps yesterday, that surprised me, but also in a wonderful way, was that you think of Ken Josephson's work when you look at this picture. Say a little bit more about that.
I'm sure I was conscious of his interesting images of a picture within a picture. Especially the one of his son with the upside down Polaroid. I'm not sure if that, as a historian, I'm sure you could check the date of this and the date of that, whether I had seen that image. But when I look at these images, I realize, or I think about that. I also, looking at this again, after all these years, I realized that shadow of my mother is sort of joining the picture with me and my daughter in a very nice way. She's sort of overshadowing the generation, you know, the passing down of her genetic talent,
right,
to her granddaughter.
And we see in works like River with Full Length Mirror, this is the color palette that I sort of associate with this later work, very vibrant, and also the sort of symbols that we've been seeing all along here. We've got palm trees, we've got this mirror. We haven't really talked about your early mirrored works, but people will learn a lot about them if they should pick up Harvest of Memory. But we've also got this water with the whole other kind of world going on underwater. And your Green River Dream is probably one of the closest quick prints that we've acquired from you to more of almost a straight print. Tell us about how you made this image and what we're looking at in the foreground there.
Okay. I could probably look it up. I can find if there was an original negative where all of this happened. But the image in the front, the river, is a sculpture that I made that's actually a full-length mirror on a tabletop. So if you consider it like a full-length mirror table, that on the mirror, I screen printed those palm trees, and then floating on the mirror, I just cut out trout, the fish, and then there's glass over the whole thing. So it's a coffee table, or it's a table that functions, but it's called a trout stream, even though they don't swim where there's palm trees, at least that kind of trout. At any rate, that's poetic license. It's a trout stream for Richard Brautigan, inspired by the book Trout Fishing in America. I have a sense of humor, which we haven't been hearing too much of, but his book cracked me up. And there's a section where the character goes into an antique store, a thrift shop, or a hardware store or something, and buys a yard of trout stream. They just roll it off and cut it and sell it to him. And that struck me as so funny that I made a yard of trout stream. So that's what that is. And that piece, I think, might have been shown at Light Gallery in that show. If not there, it might have been shown. I'll check for you and tell you where it was shown. It's a known piece. And then behind it, I'm just laying down with my eyes shut. So probably Lionel or somebody helped me shoot this. It's possible I had a tripod. And I'm wearing an amazing t-shirt, a print t-shirt that looks like my iconography. It's a flamingo. There's a moon. The moon's reflected in the water. So it was like ready-made. I didn't have to do anything. And then the skirt that I've got on has an applique cloud and lily pads and such. So it basically, I'm wearing clothing that's like my work. And that's basically all there is to it. And I went on and made a quick print with several colors. I think I did 2 versions of this print. I believe I might have done it twice, which is another thing that leads me to think it's one single negative. Occasionally, if I had a really interesting single negative, it wasn't so difficult to make more than one. So I think this one's called Golden River Dream, or maybe just
this one's green, and I do think
Green
you
River.
made another one, so that might be the one you're thinking
called
of.
Golden River Dream. Same pose and everything.
Well, and it's so interesting that the layers are not in the technique there, in the references. It's so self-referential. You're there with, it's an artwork of an artwork, and then you're in it wearing garments that also look like your artworks. And it's just this kind of, it just keeps, it's a concentric circle
It is. And
of reference.
That skirt was actually made by a former student. It was a commission piece or something,
Huh.
made deliberately to look like my artwork. So
Right.
I didn't keep it. I probably couldn't even zip it up today, but
Right.
it was a long time ago.
Well, I know that I'm grateful to have all of the stories about your life that you've shared and these wonderful works. I'm thrilled we've been able to acquire some of them, each of which have stories embedded in them. I'm sure we could do this whole talk again and come up with completely different impressions of the works. And I'm just really glad that we've been able to talk today, and I've learned a lot. Thank you very much, Bea.
It's been fun. Thanks.
Thanks.